By the turn of the 14th century, the end of the world was not a prophecy. It was a reality, riding on horseback. The Mongol Empire had become a localized apocalypse, a machine of conquest that had systematically dismantled practically every major global power that had dared to stand in its path. In 1258, Baghdad, the radiant capital of the Abbasid Caliphate, the center of the Islamic Golden Age, had been reduced to ashes. The mighty Kievan Rus to the west had been utterly crushed decades earlier, wiped from the map with calculated precision. And in the east, the great Song dynasty of China was being systematically swallowed whole, culminating in the birth of the Yuan dynasty. To the rest of the known world, the Mongol war machine was not just an opposing army. It was a force of nature, unstoppable, inevitable. They had defeated larger armies. They had defeated better equipped armies. They had outmaneuvered the most experienced commanders in practically every theater of war on Earth. But there was one place on Earth where this seemingly invincible tide crashed against a wall it simply could not break. A place where the Mongol war machine found something it could not decisively overcome. It was a system of defense that did not rely on a single stroke of luck or a solitary victory on the battlefield. It was an entire structure, deliberately constructed over years, designed to make conquest mathematically and logistically impossible. That place was the Delhi Sultanate of India, and the architect of this impenetrable system was Sultan Alauddin Khalji. What you are about to hear is not just the story of a single battle. It is the story of how a regional state, stalked by the greatest military superpower of the medieval world, built a fortress of bureaucracy, economics, and steel that survived over 2 decades of relentless invasions. This is the story of how India survived the Mongols. To understand how the Delhi Sultanate achieved this impossible feat, we first have to understand a brutal, historical truth about fighting the Mongol Empire. Defeating the Mongols was never, in any historical context, simply a matter of courage on a single battlefield. The question was never whether an army could win an isolated clash. The real question, the terrifying question, was whether a state could sustain the capacity to resist years or even decades of repeated military pressure without collapsing under the sheer economic and logistical weight of that resistance. The Mongols could lose a battle, retreat to the steppes, and return 3 years later with a force twice as large. Could their enemies afford to keep fighting? Sultan Alauddin Khalji understood this reality with chilling clarity. Khalji had assumed the throne of the Delhi Sultanate in 1296. His rise to power was ruthless, achieved by assassinating his own uncle and father-in-law, Alauddin Khalji. But whatever moral judgments history passes on his ascension, his strategic genius was undeniable. His ultimate wake-up call came in the year 1299. The Mongols launched the first massive invasion of his reign. Under the command of Kutlug Khwaja, the Mongol forces pushed all the way to the outskirts of Delhi itself, culminating in the Battle of Kili. The battle was ferocious. Against all odds, the Delhi Sultanate secured a monumental victory. Kutlug Khwaja was killed, and the invading Mongol forces were forced into a humiliating retreat. For most medieval kings, this would be a moment of ultimate triumph, a time for endless feasts and self-congratulation. But for Alauddin Khalji, it was a terrifying warning. The victory at Kili proved that the Mongols could be bled, but it also proved they were capable of striking at the very heart of his empire. And more importantly, it proved they would inevitably return. According to the renowned historian Peter Jackson, in his rigorous academic analysis of the Delhi Sultanate, the aftermath of the Battle of Kili triggered something unprecedented. Alauddin Khalji did not just recruit more men. He initiated a deliberate, systematic process of military and administrative reform that went far beyond simply raising a larger army for the next fight. Instead, he built an entirely new structure, designed specifically to sustain the Sultanate's defensive capacity for the decades of continuous warfare he knew were coming. The first, and perhaps most critical element of this reform, was completely transforming how the army of the Delhi Sultanate was funded. Before Alauddin's reign, the common practice in the Delhi Sultanate, and across much of the medieval world, was the Iqta system. The Sultan would grant large tracts of land, known as Iqtas, to military commanders. In exchange for the wealth generated by this land, the commanders were expected to maintain troops and provide military service to the Sultan. In times of peace or minor border skirmishes, the Iqta system worked fine. But against the existential threat of the Mongols, it was a fatal vulnerability. Think about it. The Iqta system created commanders with divided loyalties. They held independent territorial wealth and independent military power. If a massive Mongol horde was approaching, a local commander might prioritize defending his own land over the capital. Or worse, he might refuse to risk his private army in a desperate battle. According to the contemporary historian Ziauddin Bahrani, whose work is our most vital window into this era, Alauddin Khalji recognized this flaw and aggressively dismantled it. Khalji shifted to a system of direct cash payments. Soldiers were no longer dependent on the whims of local landholding lords. They were paid directly from a massively reinforced central treasury. By cutting out the middlemen, Khalji dramatically reduced the state's dependence on independent warlords. He centralized power. This allowed for a military mobilization that was faster, more coordinated, and directly controlled by the Sultan himself in moments of extreme crisis. And the scale of this new army was staggering. Modern estimates suggest this standing force hovered around hundreds of thousands of combatants. For the administrative standards of the 13th and 14th centuries, maintaining a permanent cash-paid force of this size was nothing short of extraordinary. But it created a massive empire-ending problem. If the state pumps an astronomical amount of cash into the economy to pay hundreds of thousands of soldiers, what happens next? Inflation. Merchants realize the soldiers have pockets full of state silver, so they raise the price of bread, grain, and cloth. Suddenly, the soldiers' paychecks aren't enough to survive. They demand higher wages, which drains the treasury faster. If the treasury runs out of money, the army mutinies. If the army mutinies, the Mongols walk right through the front gates of Delhi. To prevent this economic death spiral, Alauddin Khalji implemented a set of economic reforms that modern historians consider among the most ambitious and systematic interventions of the entire medieval period. Khalji froze the economy. He instituted a comprehensive system of price controls across the capital and its surrounding regions. The cost of every essential good, from grain and textiles to horses and weapons, was strictly regulated by the state. But passing a law is one thing, enforcing it is another. Khalji enforced his market regulations with terrifying rigidity. He appointed a vast network of market inspectors to oversee the bazaars. According to historical records, the punishments for merchants who violated the regulated prices, who dared to shortchange a customer or charge an extra coin, were brutal and uncompromising. The practical purpose of this draconian system was twofold. First, it guaranteed that soldiers, paid their fixed cash salaries, could always afford essential goods, even during periods of scarcity caused by prolonged campaigns or sieges. Second, it allowed the state to maintain a colossal military force without the costs spiraling into economic collapse. But Khalji's administrative paranoia didn't stop at the merchants. He knew the military commanders themselves were prone to corruption. Historically, military fraud was rampant. A commander might receive state funds to pay for 1,000 cavalrymen, but in reality, he only maintained 500, pocketing the rest of the gold. On inspection day, they would simply borrow horses and men from the local town to make the numbers look correct. To destroy this practice, Khalji introduced a system known as Dagh, the physical branding of military horses. Every war horse paid for by the state received a permanent, registered mark. You could no longer pass off a merchant's pack horse as a royal cavalry mount. Parallel to this, he implemented the Chehra system. This was a detailed, physical descriptive role of the soldiers themselves. Before photography existed, the state recorded the exact facial features, height, and distinguishing marks of every soldier on the payroll. This meant the central government knew exactly who was in the army and exactly how many horses were ready to ride. This level of granular administrative control would prove absolutely vital during the rapid mobilizations required in the years to come. But armies and economies are only part of a defense. You also need walls. Beyond the financial and administrative overhauls, Khalji poured massive resources into the physical reinforcement of his empire. Archaeological evidence and historical texts confirm that he significantly expanded the defenses of Delhi and other strategic cities along the expected Mongol invasion routes. Most notably, he constructed a new fortified settlement known as Siri. This wasn't just a vanity project. Modern historical analysis confirms Siri was built as a direct, explicit response to the continuous Mongol threat. A hardened defensive position designed to absorb a massive assault. This physical infrastructure complemented the military and economic reforms, creating a multi-layered defense system, rapid mobilization, long-term economic sustainability, physical fortresses. It was a machine designed for one purpose: survival. And that machine was about to be pushed to its absolute breaking point. Following the initial Battle of Kili in 1299, the Delhi Sultanate faced at least 4 more massive Mongol invasions over the next decade, specifically documented in 1300, 1303, 1305, and 1306. This frequency of sustained, high-intensity warfare would have completely shattered almost any other state. Without the structural reforms Khalji had put in place, the Sultanate would have run out of money, men, or food. The ultimate test came in 1303. Under the command of a Mongol leader identified in sources as Targi, the Mongols bypassed the border defenses and drove straight for the heart of the Sultanate. The campaign was exceptionally severe, bringing devastation to the civilian populations in its path. This invasion is widely considered by modern historiography as the closest the Delhi Sultanate ever came to complete annihilation. The Mongol forces were so massive and their movement so swift that they managed to do the unthinkable. They effectively besieged the capital city of Delhi itself. Alauddin Khalji was forced into a deeply cautious, defensive posture. Rather than risking his army in an open-field battle against a vastly superior Mongol force, he pulled his forces behind the newly reinforced fortifications of Siri and Delhi. The city was surrounded, cut off from the outside world. The Mongols settled in, expecting the city to starve, expecting the economy to collapse, expecting the treasury to empty and the soldiers to mutiny. That was how the Mongols broke cities. But Delhi did not break. The price controls held. The granaries, managed by the state, rationed out food at fixed prices. The soldiers, paid in cash from a secure central treasury, remained loyal. The newly built walls of Siri absorbed the shock. Despite the gravity of the threat, recognized consistently as the moment Delhi came closest to falling, the city survived. The Mongols, unable to breach the walls, unable to starve out the defenders, and running out of supplies themselves in hostile territory, were eventually forced to abandon the siege and retreat. The siege of 1303 proved that Alauddin Khalji's system worked. The administrative and logistical sustainability he had built literally saved the empire from extinction. By the time the subsequent invasions of 1305 and 1306 occurred, the dynamic had shifted. The Sultanate's defensive capacity was now fully consolidated and lethally effective. In both of these later invasions, Alauddin Khalji's forces did not just hide behind walls. They marched out and inflicted absolutely devastating defeats on the invading Mongol armies before they could achieve any substantial territorial gains. A particularly notable aspect of these later clashes is how Khalji's response evolved. It became progressively more aggressive and deeply punitive. This wasn't just about defense anymore. It was about deterrence. The treatment of captured Mongol prisoners during these later campaigns was incredibly severe. Modern historians interpret this brutality as a calculated strategy of political and military communication. Khalji was sending a message back to the steppes of Central Asia. If you cross into my territory, you will not return. And underpinning all of these military victories was one final, crucial layer of Khalji's system: intelligence. Parallel to his economic and military overhauls, Khalji developed a highly sophisticated espionage network. Agents were tasked with monitoring movements not just within the Sultanate, but far beyond the borderlands where the Mongol forces typically gathered. This spy network provided the administration with advanced warnings, allowing the newly streamlined cash-paid army to mobilize and intercept threats before they could penetrate deep into the Indian heartland. The historical legacy of this monumental clash between the Delhi Sultanate and the Mongol Empire extends far beyond the casualty counts of individual battles. Historians view this era as one of the most significant case studies in the entire history of the Mongol conquests. It stands as a testament to how a state managed to survive not just a single brush with death, but over a decade of repeated, terrifying pressure. When you compare the fate of the Delhi Sultanate to the countless other civilizations that were wiped off the map by the Mongols, a clear lesson emerges. The Mongols could overwhelm almost any tactical formation. They could outshoot and outride almost any cavalry. But they could not outlast a perfect logistical machine. Alauddin Khalji proved that in the ultimate crucible of war, structural, administrative, and economic resilience is often more decisive than mere heroism on the battlefield. India defended itself against the greatest conquerors in history, not just with swords and shields, but with ledgers, price controls, and an unbreakable system of statecraft. So, we leave you with a question to ponder. What do you think was the most decisive factor in this incredible historical defense? Was it Alauddin Khalji's brilliant administrative and economic reforms? Or do you think the vast geography and sheer distance from the Mongol heartland in Central Asia would have eventually stopped them anyway? Let us know your thoughts, and until next time, keep exploring the hidden mechanics of history.